forward and hope that does the trick. Welcome everybody who is here. It's really exciting to see that we have some people outside of Worcester, Massachusetts here today. That's pretty exciting. And as I've said a bunch of times, that this topic is really incredibly important. Most of us who work at all in treatment settings have come in contact with people that have been abused. I am so grateful to my bestie, Lori Dawson, for doing this today. She has a PhD in psychology and has lived experience with this topic. The last time she did it, we were all in person, and it was kind of amazing that we were all in person, and we did not recognize how lucky we were. And we really, I think, have taken that for granted to be with other people. So we so miss that. But the good news about the Zoom is that it gets recorded and it's available to a much wider audience. So, and with a topic that can be really challenging, people might prefer to watch the recording. So I guess with that, I am gonna turn it over to Lori Dawson. Thank you, Lori.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks, Amy.
I'm going to be monitoring the chat throughout Lori's presentation. So if people have comments or questions there, it's hard to do your slide deck and the chat. So I'm going to take care of that for her.
So I want to try to cover a fair amount of ground today. And one of the things you should know about me is I tend to be very geeky, but very informal. So if you have any questions, Amy is going to monitor the chat, but also feel free to unmute yourself and just say, excuse me, and stop me. Because sometimes chat, there's a lag before you get to answer your question. And if there's something that you're interested in, I would love to be able to chat with you in real time. So don't be afraid to ask me a question. I want to talk a little bit about prevalence and the progression of abuse, offenders and what they look like and what they do. And then most of the time, I'm going to talk about developmental consequences of abuse. And for better or worse, I'm going to talk about neurobiology for the better part of the section on development, because most of the discussions on development focus on social emotional, and that's important, but they gloss over some of the other stuff. So let's get started. The research on sexual abuse in children estimates that 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 girls will be sexually molested before she's 18. And between 1 in 7 and 1 in 20 boys. And you see that wide range in boys because there's not as much research that's done with male survivors. And we believe that that range, the estimate, is probably much closer to the 1 in 7 than the 1 in 20 for boys, because men in general of all ages are much less likely to report abuse, sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional abuse, because of kind of the traditional masculine gender roles that men aren't victims, this sort of toxic masculinity stuff, and homophobia, especially if the boy is abused by an adult man. So therefore, the higher end of the scale, the 1 in 7, is probably more likely for boys. One of the things that I want to point out is that when we talk about child abusers, oftentimes people use the term pedophile interchangeably. And not all perpetrators are pedophiles. In fact, the majority of people who sexually abuse children are not pedophiles. So I want to explain the difference. A pedophile is someone whose primary sexual attraction is to children. And this attraction usually develops early in adolescence. So if you think about when you first began to develop a sexual attraction and noticed that you were attracted to men, you were attracted to women, you were attracted to people of all genders, how old were you when you made that realization? You were pretty young. Pedophiles notice that attraction to children relatively young. Their behavior tends to be compulsive and premeditated. And so if you understand that you're attracted to children when you're young, you could theoretically plan your career around having access to children. And not only having access to children, but being seen as a trusted adult. So you could be a teacher, you could be a member of the clergy, you could be a therapist, you could be a camp counselor, you could be a Boy Scout leader, which isn't a career, but certainly a trusted adult. So, people oftentimes seem shocked when these kind of pillars of the community are found out to be sexual abusers. But really, if they're pedophiles, it makes a lot of sense. They also oftentimes tend to identify with their victims. They equalize their behavior to the level of the child, and they tend to assume this pseudo-parental role. Boys are more likely to be targets than girls of pedophiles. And the FBI classifies pedophiles as preferential offenders, and they have categories called preferential offenders versus situational offenders. So here's some information from the FBI on preferential offenders. So they separate preferential offenders into 3 categories: seductive, fixated, and sadistic. Seductive preferential offenders often court children. They give them a lot of affection, love, gifts, and entice them in order to carry out a relationship. And I'm going to talk more about the seduction and grooming of children in a couple of minutes. The fixated preferential offender tends to have poor psychosocial development, and they desire affection from children and tend to be compulsively attracted to children. And for these folks, the fixation on children tends to be that because they have poor psychosexual development, children tend to be really unquestioningly loving and accepting of people. So if you have poor interpersonal skills, you might be someone where an adult would kind of cut you a new one. But children just are accepting as they are. So they look to children for this sort of unconditional support and love. And then finally, sadistic pedophiles are luckily in the minority, the smallest group of pedophiles, but the most dangerous. They're aggressive, they're excited by violence. Unlike the seductive offenders who tend to court children and use psychological manipulation to gain access to children, sadistic pedophiles will use violence to gain access, and often will murder their victims when they're done with them. This is in contrast to situational offenders. So remember, the preferential offenders, the FBI category of preferential offenders, I'm calling them, as a psychologist, I'm calling them pedophiles. Situational offenders, I would not categorize as pedophiles. I would call them opportunistic offenders. Situational offenders, they are primarily attracted to adults, but will sexually abuse kids if they have an opportunity. And they have maybe different reasons for sexually abusing kids that we'll get into in a minute, but their primary attraction is not to kids. And here the FBI has 4 categories of situational offenders. The first one is regressed. These are people who have poor coping skills. They target kids who are easily accessible. So kids who are in the neighborhood, kids who are family members or extended family members, and they substitute them for adult relationships. So they're just easily acceptable, easy targets. The second group are morally indiscriminate. And these offenders, again, don't prefer children over adults, but if you think about someone who's morally indiscriminate, people who are morally indiscriminate don't give a crap about anybody else, and they'll do whatever they damn well please, including abuse children for their own gratification. And this is slightly different from sexually indiscriminate. People who are sexually indiscriminate tend to be people who are really interested in sexual experimentation of all kinds. So they're not necessarily morally indiscriminate in every aspect of their lives, but they're interested in experimenting sexually. Out of boredom, they might sexually abuse children, along with all sorts of other kinds of sex acts. And then finally, the inadequate category are people who are kind of social misfits, who are insecure, have low self-esteem, and they seek out children similar to one of the other categories I talked about, because children are more accepting of them. So what we find is that in the majority of cases, sexual abusers don't have to use physical force in order to get children to comply with their wishes. They tend to use psychological manipulation. So the progression of sexual assault of children tends to look like what we see here. The first phase is called an engagement phase, where the perpetrator gains access to the child, gains their trust, and establishes a special relationship with them. So they can pay a lot of attention to the child. They can give them special favors. They can be extra nice to them, especially a child who maybe doesn't get a lot of attention at home. Maybe their parents are busy. Maybe they have a lot of siblings and they're just kind of one of many. For whatever reason, this child feels special with this person. They get to do special things. They get special attention. And this means that the adult begins to gain the child's trust, and the child wants to be with this person. And then the perpetrator engages in a number of grooming behaviors. Once they gain the psychological trust and emotional closeness, then they engage in typically a progression of sexual behaviors. And people often are surprised to learn that usually the sexual behaviors are not genital behaviors early on. If you think about someone who has access to a child on an ongoing basis, they don't need to jump into genital sex right away. They can gradually indoctrinate them into a sexual relationship. So for example, this doesn't have to go exactly the way it says under that column of grooming behaviors, but they can, be naked in front of them. And this might be something like they, accidentally on purpose, leave the door open to the bathroom while they're going to the bathroom. Or if they're at a swimming pool changing, they change in front of them. I'm like, oh, that's no big thing. Or disrobe in front of them. Or watch the child disrobe. If they have already started to be physically affectionate with the child, hugging them, then they start to kiss them. And the kisses probably are on the cheeks at first. And then they might kiss them on the mouth, and it's a closed mouth kiss. And then it might become an open mouth kiss. And then there might be some fondling, which might be rubbing their back. And then the back rub might go down to their butt. Or it might be rubbing their shoulders that goes down to their chest. And then it might be rubbing that goes to their genitals. And it might be outer course, which, if you haven't heard that term, is kind of rubbing against somebody else's genitals with your genitals, and so forth. So early on, it's not often explicit penetrative sex. And so this progression lets them gradually indoctrinate a kid so that one behavior is not all that different from the one before. So it's not that shocking, the next thing that happens. It's sort of like the analogy of how to cook a frog. And I don't know if you ever heard that analogy. I've never cooked a frog personally, but theoretically, if you have to cook a frog, you put it in a pot of cold water. Because if you put it in a pot of boiling water, the frog would jump out. But if you put it in a pot of cold water and turn the heat on, as the water gradually warms, the frog gets used to it little by little, and it's cooked before it knows it. So these grooming behaviors gradually get the child to get used to this kind of sexual contact. So the sexual contact happens in the second category, usually in a coercive way. Sometimes it happens in a forced way, as it says there, but it's usually not. Because most sexual assaults, and I have this on another slide, I guess I didn't introduce it yet, but the vast majority, one of the things that if you take nothing else from this, I hope you remember, is that we do such a disservice to kids when our prevention efforts focus on stranger danger. I almost lose my damn mind when people talk about stranger danger, because 75% of people or more who are sexually assaulted across the lifespan from birth to death are sexually assaulted by people they know. So when we talk about stranger danger to little kids, we are doing them such a disservice. First of all, we're making them afraid of strangers. And second, we're giving them a false sense of security that Uncle so-and-so, even though he's putting his hand down my pants, is perfectly safe, that this is normal. Or when we talk to someone who's in college who is raped by a date, and then we tell them that wasn't real rape because you were on a date and it wasn't someone jumping out from behind a parked car in a parking lot. So yes, especially in the case of sadistic pedophiles, it can be forced. But most often, it's psychological coercion. And the abuser relies on the ability to bribe, to psychologically manipulate, to coerce in order to have that continued access. at some point, there may be a disclosure. That disclosure might happen in childhood. It might happen in adulthood. It might happen on accident. It might happen on purpose. And never underestimate people's ability to not see what they don't want to see. In a couple slides down the road, we'll talk about factors that affect the degree of trauma. And one of them is not just the abuse, but the inability or unwillingness for a non-abusive parent to adequately protect a child. So in my case, it was my paternal grandfather who sexually abused me for years and years. We were poor. We lived in a tenement house on the first floor, and my grandparents lived upstairs. And he didn't just abuse me, he abused some other people who lived there. But since this is going out to the universe, I am not going to say anything else for their privacy. And I didn't disclose this information until I was an adult. And at the time when I did disclose, my father was furious with me and said, "Why are you telling us this now when we can't do anything about this? You've just ruined your mother's life. She's going to carry this to her grave." And then began this whole litany of victim blaming things like, "Why didn't you stop it?" Well, maybe because I was 4, whatever. And then the victim blaming lasted for a very long time. I made my peace with my father, but my mother kept it up. And so there's Lori, the daughter, and there's Lori, the person who has a damn PhD in psychology who specializes in abuse. And I tried to educate my mother over and over and over again with very little success. And I just sort of tried to let that go until almost right before she died. I was visiting her and I just thought, she's just never going to get it. And just accepted, she didn't know what was happening and blah, blah, blah. And she said to me again, right before she died, she's like, "I just didn't know." And she lays this line on me. "I did always think it was weird that time I walked into the bathroom and you were naked with Grandpa and he had his hands he had his hands on you." I'm like, I almost lost my mind. Like, "So you knew? And she was like, "No, I didn't know. I didn't know." And I guess, like, to be as generous as I can be, it was out of the realm of possibility for her that a grandfather could do that to somebody. So I don't know. But if children don't feel that they can tell, they oftentimes don't. And there's a lot of shame involved in this. And the abuser, as part of their coercive tactics, will often say, "No one's going to abuse you. They're going to blame you. They're going to send you away. They're going to hate you. If you tell, I'll kill myself. If you tell, I'll kill you. If you tell, I'll kill your parents." So like the level of coercion could be mild or it could be really scary. And then after the disclosure phase, there tends to be a suppression phase where people close to the child encourage them to recant. And when I, at some point in my life, I worked in a residential facility for boys who had been sexually abused, and most of them were there because their mothers refused to leave their partners who had sexually abused their sons. And many of them were upset that their sons would not take back their testimony. And so they relinquished custody rather than move forward and prosecute the abuser. So that's one example. And then another example, not so extreme, is that people find this really embarrassing. It's going to cause shame. It's going to bring shame to the family name. And so they would rather sacrifice a child, sacrifice a child's mental health and well-being than cause any possible shame to their name. For people who work with kids or happen to be mandated reporters, and mandated reporters are just people who are legally required by the law to report the suspicion of abuse. And it's a lot of people. It could be teachers, childcare workers, doctors, therapists, social workers, police officers. A lot of people are mandated reporters. And none of them really get training in what they're looking for. So I just want to briefly put up some indicators of child sexual assault. I think they make sense, but if anyone has a question about why a certain thing is indicative of sexual assault, please let me know because I want to explain it. So difficulty in walking or sitting, torn, stained, or bloody underwear, genital, anal itching or pain or swelling or burning, genital or anal bruising or bleeding, frequent urinary tract or yeast infections, pain on urination, poor sphincter control, that could be anal or urinary, sexually transmitted diseases, pregnancy. So these are, obviously adolescent girls with pregnancy, chronic unexplained sore throats. That could be a yeast infection, thrush in the throat. Frequent psychosomatic illnesses. We'll talk in a little bit about how this affects your somatic system. And then loss of appetite. And then behavioral indicators, an inability to trust, anger and hostility, inappropriate sexual behavior. And here I'm not talking about sexual experimentation that lots of kids do. I'm talking about a level of sexual knowledge that would be beyond their typical developmental or age level. Depression, guilt or shame, problems in school, somatic complaints, sleep disturbances, eating disorders, phobic behavior, regressive behavior, which means they're acting younger than they are, self-destructive or accident-prone behavior, running away, or hypervigilance. How much this experience affects kids depends on a number of factors. The first one is the identity of the offender. And in general, the closer the person is to you, the more a violation of trust it is. So a family member or a very trusted adult typically is more of a violation of your sense of trust and your ability to trust other human beings than a stranger. And here's where I put the lifespan thing, which could have gone earlier. The duration of the abuse. Later, we're going to talk about the difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. In general, the longer the abuse goes on, the more severe the trauma. the extent of the abuse, whether it is fondling, whether it's, oral sex, whether there is digital penetration or genital penetrative sex. The age when the abuse starts. In general, we develop coping mechanisms as we grow up. And the older we become, the better our coping mechanisms become. The more sophisticated our coping mechanisms become. When we're abused, when we're kids, we don't have a lot of coping mechanisms. And the younger we are, the less developed our coping mechanisms are. And some trauma specialists would say that in a way, our coping mechanisms, or some of our coping mechanisms, are kind of frozen in time at T-1, which means like whatever the age you were when you were first traumatized. There's a part of you that goes to that kind of coping mechanism that you used when you were 3 years old or 7 years old, or however it was, however you were. So the younger you were, the more difficult it will often be. The reactions of others to the disclosure of abuse is actually one that really has a big impact. So when we talk to kids about abuse, other than stranger danger, which I've already told you makes me crazy, what we tell them is, go tell a trusted adult. So you're a kid, you've been abused. You've listened to this message and you're going to go tell a trusted adult. You tell this trusted adult. And what if they tell you, you're a liar? Are you going to go to your second choice? Or are you going to feel so ashamed and hurt and confused that you just shut down? I'm guessing it's the second thing. And I'm guessing that's going to really traumatize you. The only thing to say, whether you believe a kid or not, and I would argue the only thing to say to anyone of any age who has told you that they have been victimized, whether you believe them or not, is, I'm so sorry this happened to you. What can I do to help? You can sort the other shit out later privately. You don't need to re-traumatize them in that moment. And then, the point at which it was disclosed, and then, the personality of the child. We all have different personalities. Some of us tend to shrug things off. Some of us tend to internalize things. Some of us tend to externalize things. How are we doing for questions? I see a lot of stuff in chat, but I don't hear anything. So
people are just, kind of commenting and making sense of some of the things that you said. And as far as I understand, it's like less than 1% of the time kids are lying about this.
Yeah.
So if a kid tells you, they're telling the truth. You need to believe them. When a false accusation is made, it's usually adults that are making the accusations. Kids don't really make false accusations.
Well, let me jump in there. I don't know what the adult, what they're referring to in terms of adults making false accusations.
Like in a case of a divorce where I
okay.
might say my husband did this to my kid.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, using children in that way, but I want to be really clear. Adults and children, people of all ages, false accusations of sexual assault across the lifespan are exceedingly rare. And, this whole thing that women cry rape, like, less than 0.5% of rapists ever see a day in jail. less than the FBI. So not any like rape crisis center or feminazi organization that I might associate with. And I use that term sarcastically. The FBI, not known to be like major feminists, believe that 1 in 10 rapes is ever reported, not to the police, like ever reported to anybody. People who work in rape crisis centers believe that's probably 1 in 100, but the FBI says 1 in 10. And they believe of all major crimes, it's the one that has the lowest rate of false accusation. So believe kids and believe adults as well. One of the things that may happen after traumatic experiences is, and we're not going to talk about a lot of clinical diagnoses today, but I do want to talk briefly about post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD, most people are familiar with. The criterion, one of the first diagnostic criterion is that someone has to be exposed to something that's really horrific, a death, a threatened death, something where people think that their life is in danger. They have to have direct exposure or witness the trauma or learn about a trauma or have indirect exposure where they have a lot of explicit, horrible, gory details. But note that all of these things could potentially involve just a single incident. Complex PTSD, which is still, by the way, not officially accepted. I don't think, Amy might know, to the best of my knowledge, it's still not officially in the DSM, was first proposed a long time ago, in 1988, by a Harvard psychologist named Judith Herman, who has, well, she is now deceased, spent her entire professional career studying sexual trauma. One of her first books, if not her first book, was called Father-Daughter Incest. And she went on to write many more books.
Trauma and Recovery, her book, is what I use when I'm teaching a class in this. And it really is an excellent book if people are looking for kind of more information. As far as, we have not put complex PTSD into the DSM. I believe that the European equivalent has, but we have not. You're right.
Yeah. So one of the things that she said early on is that people who experience inescapable long-term trauma are different than people who have experienced a single episode of trauma. And one of her quotes is in the bottom corner, where she says, most people have no knowledge or understanding of the psychological changes of captivity. Social judgment of chronically traumatized people therefore tends to be extremely harsh. And one of the ways that psychologically, and again, I won't get into it, one of the things that is in the DSM is a diagnosis called borderline personality disorder, which many say is similar to complex PTSD, but that diagnosis is like the kiss of death. Therapists want nothing to do with you if you have borderline personality disorder, typically. They think it's one of the hardest things to do. But what she proposed many, many years ago, and what we are now finding is deeply rooted in actual fact and in physical science, is that it affects virtually every aspect of your life. So it affects social emotional development, where that's mostly what people talk about, where people are depressed and have difficulties with their relationships. It affects behavioral components like sexual acting out and impulsivity, cognitive difficulties like changes in identity and dissociation, physical problems, somatic illnesses. And although her work really focuses on trauma, that diagnosis now, or proposed diagnosis, applies to anyone who's experienced prolonged trauma, including people who are refugees, prisoners of war, people who have been sex trafficked, people who experience or witness domestic violence, among others. So with her work in mind, we need to acknowledge that all areas of development are affected by child sexual abuse, not just the area of development that most people talk about, which is the social and emotional areas of development. So we have social emotional. So developmental psychologists, sorry, take a step back. And I am a social personality psychologist, and my specialty is abuse. But developmental psychologists talk about 3 areas of development, typically: social emotional, physical, and cognitive. And when people talk about abuse, they almost always explicitly focus on social emotional development. And so I'm going to talk about social emotional development today, but I'm also going to talk about physical development and cognitive development. And you're going to have to suffer through a lot of physical development. When I went to grad school, they didn't have a lot of the brain imaging technology that they have now. I was not aware of the research in neurobiology. If I were to start grad school today, I would be a neurobiologist. I'm fascinated by it. So there's a lot of stuff on neurobiology in there. So I think it's interesting because you might have heard some of the, so if you've heard anything about what happens with abuse, you've probably heard the social emotional stuff. You probably haven't heard the physical stuff, and maybe not the cognitive stuff either. So bear with me. So the earliest thing that happens in terms of social emotional problems is with attachment. One of the people who studied attachment early on is Ainsworth. And she studied how children become attached to their parents. There were others before her, but her theory is the one that is most often cited and has been used by other psychologists. And Ainsworth said that children use their parents to help explore the world around them. They use them as a safe haven. So they reference their parents. Like if they're in a new situation, they kind of look up at their parents like, is this a safe place to be? Am I okay? They tend to stay close to their parents when they're in a new place. And when their parents are away from them, they get a little distressed. And what she noticed about kids and their interactions with parents helped her create a research situation that she called the strange situation, to assess how kids are attached to their parent. And I keep saying parent because I'm trying to be gender neutral here, but in her original research, which was done several decades ago, it was a mother. Subsequently, people have done it with parents of all genders, but it was a mother initially. So the experiment went like this. The mother and the child, toddler, old enough to crawl, are brought into a room where the child has never been before. Child's placed on the floor and allowed to explore the room, crawl around. And the child exploring this room, now new room, typically would like look up at the mother, like, is this okay? I crawl around. Might not go too far, proximity maintenance. If they go too far and they might get scared by something, they go back toward the mother. That's the safe haven. And they explore a little bit. Then a stranger enters the room, talks to the mother, and goes toward the child. Stranger in the room, kid's not going to be all that comfortable, goes back toward the mom. The parent, the mom, then leaves the room, and the toddler is alone with the stranger. Typically, this would cause some distress. And then, a couple minutes later, the mother comes back. And what you would typically see in a child who is securely attached to its mother is that the child would return to the mother to feel comforted and feel safe again. So that's the experiment that she did, called the strange situation. And if a child is what she called securely attached, that's what the child would do, go back to the mother. And in order to get a secure attachment, Ainsworth said, you don't have to be a perfect parent, you have to kind of be a good enough parent, an adequate parent. And adequate parenting involves two things: consistency of care and quality of care. And here I have it divided into high and low. So a high quality of care or a low quality of care. But I don't want you to think like high quality is like super high quality. It's like, it's good. Not great, maybe, but it's good. And then the consistency of care, like pretty consistent. Like if you're hungry and crying, you're going to get fed. Versus low, like if I'm hungry and crying, sometimes I get fed and sometimes I don't. Or sometimes my parent is good to me and sometimes they're not good to me. Okay. So if in general, I have pretty decent care, most of the time, I'm going to have a secure attachment. If I have pretty decent care, but it's not consistent, I'm not going to be sure about how I feel about that. I'm going to be kind of ambivalent. And that's what she calls that category, ambivalent. If I consistently, so high consistency, I consistently have poor care, I'm going to be avoidant. Why do I go near you? You never take care of me. That's avoidant. And if I inconsistently have low quality of care, sometimes it's low, sometimes it's not, it's going to be disorganized. Okay, so those are her 4 categories. And I don't expect you to read all of this, but you can look at the slides or the tape or whatever later. With each of these 4 categories, through her research, she's looked at what percentage of the population fall into those categories, what the child tends to be like, what their kind of characteristics are like. So for example, secure attachment leads to kind of secure, happy kids. Ambivalent tends to be anxious and insecure kids. Then it looks like the mother's responsiveness, like quick and sensitive, inconsistent. We really talked about the mother's responsiveness in the previous slide. And then what the kid tends to think, like a securely attached child believes that their needs are going to be met because their needs are typically always met. And if you believe your needs are going to be met, you're going to have, in general, a fairly trusting view on the world. If you have an ambivalent attachment, where sometimes your needs are met and sometimes they're not. You're kind of going to feel about the world in general that you're not sure if you can trust people. You don't know if your needs are going to be met, and so forth. Okay. And Ainsworth would say that this isn't just about toddlers and their parents. This is something that follows you with other relationships as you grow. And not only does it follow you through your childhood, but other researchers, Hazen and Shaver, namely, have looked at how your attachment style as a child plays out in your adult relationships. So here, as an example, is the comparison of secure attachment in children and secure attachment in adulthood. So, again, this is sort of the best case scenario. But in this slide is each of those four and what it would look like in adulthood. So again, I'm not going to go over secure. You're golden. Everything's great. But I'll give you, like, again, the preoccupied. You have a lot of flooded emotions. You're self-critical. You seek out praise. You are less empathic. You have difficulty forgiving. You tend to be jealous and preoccupied. You have trouble communicating, and so forth. And again, there's a lot of information here, but it shows you that these kinds of difficulties follow you in your ability to attain and maintain meaningful, caring relationships in adulthood. So now I'm going to delve into the physical development piece and the neurobiology of abuse. And here's where I said a lot of this wasn't in existence when I went to graduate school. But one of the things they use now are brain imaging techniques, magnetic MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging. And there are a couple of different kinds now. There's an fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging, and DTIs. And I'm not going to get into the differences between them. Well, they're kind of sophisticated MRIs that show certain, they're able to show where certain brain centers are activated, and even can show certain ways that different areas of the brain are communicating with each other. So I think it's very cool. So for example, on the left, it shows what areas of the brain are activated in response to a scary stimulus. And you see there's not a lot of brain activation in people who don't have PTSD. And for people who do, this is a lot of limbic system activation here. The limbic system, the area of the brain that regulates fear, among other things. And here are the kind of neural networks. I'm actually not going to get into that because I'm going to move on. In a very simplified view, I'm going to move here. We can talk about something called the triune brain, which is just a very simplified kind of conceptualization of three parts of the brain. Of course, the brain has tons of parts, but basically, if we think of three parts of the brain, the back of the brain is the brainstem. That's the least sophisticated part of the brain, but the part of the brain that's most responsible for us to live or die. It controls breathing, it controls heartbeat, it controls balance. If you get a bad injury in your brainstem, you're probably going to die. The midsection of the brain controls the limbic system. The limbic system is responsible for memory, and it's responsible for emotion. And we're going to talk a lot about the limbic system for the next 15 minutes or so. And then the front of your brain, the frontal lobes, especially the prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain that's responsible for the most human levels of thinking, the highest orders of thinking, typically the abilities that people say make us most human. Okay. And when we talk about trauma, trauma affects multiple parts of our brain. And as I said earlier, especially with child abuse, child sexual abuse, these parts of our brain are being affected very early in life. And the earlier they're affected, typically the more dramatic the effect is going to be. And so we're going to talk about mostly, except for one, we're going to talk about the prefrontal cortex, and then all of the other things we're going to talk about are in the limbic system. Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the amygdala. The amygdala is the fear center of the brain. Its primary purpose is to quickly assess danger. And if you're in danger, it activates your flight or fight response, pushes adrenaline into your system so you can get the hell out of there or you can fight. So it has to assess danger and it has to do it quickly. And the more threatening it is, the more it's going to activate. Okay. It also activates something called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. I'm going to explain that in a minute. When it activates the brainstem and the sympathetic nervous system to pump out adrenaline, it simultaneously shuts down the prefrontal cortex. So if you're pumped up with adrenaline, you're not thinking straight. You're not like being able to engage in a lot of rational thinking. You're just like in survival mode. And what happens with people who have experienced complex trauma and people with anxiety disorder often is that their amygdala is chronically hyperactivated. They're chronically feeling a sense of fear that makes it difficult for them to think clearly, makes it difficult for them to engage in coping strategies. They often see things that are really, that other people think are really not that threatening. They think are threatening. They perceive it as more threatening than others. And so it's hard to relax. So treatment to reduce that activation, and all of the treatments that I mentioned here, because I'm talking about physiologically based things, all of the treatments are physiological. This is, there are lots of treatment for trauma, and many of them. So when I talked about attachment, there's a whole large body of work on attachment therapy for trauma, which is extremely helpful. There's a whole body of work on trauma-informed care. And this body of work is really somatic therapy, mind-body therapy. So treatment to reduce activation of the amygdala reduces the stress response, reduces reactivity to trauma triggers, and reduces hypervigilance. So let me explain the HPA axis, which is part of this as well. So the HPA axis stands for hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and adrenal cortex. And you probably have heard something about this, even if you don't think you ever have. Because if you've ever seen a commercial that talks about that stubborn belly fat, that is based on the HPA axis. So what happens? When the amygdala gets activated, it sends a signal to the hypothalamus. which then releases corticotropin releasing hormone, which is called CRH. Corticotropin releasing hormone then activates the pituitary gland, which releases something called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. ACTH activates the adrenal gland, which then releases cortisol. In a chronic stressed condition where the amygdala is overactivated, it causes a persistent alarm reaction where cortisol is being overproduced, and you have this overexposure to cortisol, which is often called the stress hormone. And it also has a direct and indirect feedback effect among those three endocrine glands, which I'm not going to get into right now. But it just really screws them up. We'll leave it at that. In addition, to dysregulating all of those glands, it also is involved with a number of body functions that it dysregulates, including digestion, lowering the immune system, messing with your emotions and your memory, decreasing sexual enjoyment, dysregulating ovarian function, and dysregulating energy storage and expenditure, which really means that it dysregulates your body's ability to expend fat cells. So they stick around, and typically they tend to be stored primarily in your abdomen, which is why those commercials exist about that stubborn belly fat due to excess cortisol. Well, that's all about the amygdala. The next structure is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the memory center of the brain, which stores memories that you can consciously access. Trauma causes the hippocampus to become underactive and, in some cases, even shrink in size. And an underactive hippocampus can cause inaccurate memories. So the problem with that, well, there are several problems, but one of those problems, is that if the hippocampus inaccurately remembers a situation that's similar to one that's happening now, and it remembers it as being dangerous when it wasn't really dangerous, it's going to signal, it's going to relay to the amygdala, oh, that thing that happened before, that was dangerous. So now the amygdala is going to think the thing that's happening right now is dangerous, even when it's not. But it's because the hippocampus said that other thing was dangerous, the amygdala is going to act like this thing is dangerous, and it's going to trigger the fear response. It's going to activate the sympathetic nervous system. We're going to have this massive dump of adrenaline. It's going to activate the HPA axis and going to have a hyperarousal.
Can you share why the memory would remember something that wasn't dangerous as dangerous? Can you give an example?
Yeah, so the hippocampus, because it is underactivated, it tends to not store memories correctly. And it's also the case that trauma memories, and I want to explain this to you, but I don't want to oversimplify or get into it, because people tend to use this information to discredit trauma survivors. But one of the things that we know is that trauma memories tend to be more sensory than sequential. And it's more complex than I can adequately do justice here. But so if you can think about, there's a slide. Hold on one second. Let me see where I put this.
Sorry, you said
No,
trauma.
that's okay. I want to tell you. So here,
Can you just
like,
reiterate?
I
trauma
didn't note it.
tend to be
Sorry,
more what? They,
pardon me.
trauma memories tend to be more what than sequential?
They tend to be somatic. They tend to be sensory. So in the slide I showed previously, but I forgot to mention it, there's a very famous book by this guy named Bessel van der Kolk. Oops, sorry. Where did it go again? In this slide, the book is called The Body Keeps the Score. And it talks about the idea that oftentimes people cannot consciously access memories, but they have body sensations or sensory memories. So, for example, if someone, okay, let me give you. If someone's hair was pulled during a sexual assault and pulled violently, they might have sensations of their hair being pulled. They might have memories or feelings like their hair is being pulled, but they don't know why. Another sensory thing, my grandfather wore Old Spice. I hate the smell of that. My son, who's 17, bought himself Old Spice deodorant. And every time I smell it, like I have a physical, visceral reaction to it. So trauma memories tend to be more fragmented. So you remember like somebody knocked you down, and then you remember like the smell of what that person was like. And then you remember what they said to you. So it is not like first this happened and then this happened and then this happened. And so if you go report it to the police, they want a very sequential recounting of what happened. And if you're remembering things in bits and pieces and smells and sights, they are not happy with you. And if you're remembering some pieces and then you remember something else later and your story doesn't seem consistent, they take that as a sign that you're fabricating the details. So, and there are different parts of the brain responsible for conscious sequential memory and memory that's related to sensory memory. And so the hippocampus, being the part that's more responsible for this kind of sequential ability to articulate memories, gets underactivated. And so the ability to recall this kind of sequential retelling becomes difficult. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, thank you. That's so helpful. I have one more question relevant to this.
Yeah.
So I have been working with this kind of like window memories and bits and pieces for a long time in my own healing. I just am curious about, sometimes I have the experience of like I remember and I know I remember. And then there's other times where I kind of remember, but I don't really, it feels really far away from me and I don't really believe it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
even though there are other times where it's like, obviously, I know that's true.
Yep.
What is that?
Okay. So I want to be really clear that I am not a clinician. I'm a researcher. I
Okay.
can tell you what I believe based on my experiences and what clinicians have told me.
Okay.
But different clinicians would have different belief systems about this. Okay. Are you familiar with internal family systems therapy?
Yes.
Ever heard of that? No? Yes?
Yes, I am. Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry. I'm having trouble hearing you a little bit.
Sorry, I think my computer's too far away.
Okay. So in internal family systems there, I like it. So let me just say, for those of you who haven't heard of it, I really resonate with internal family systems therapy because I think it is a very non-pathologizing therapy. Some therapists would answer you by saying that you are dissociating, that when you aren't remembering things, like this is a dissociative disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And that, so to be really clear for those of you who aren't familiar, dissociation falls on a continuum. Like at the extreme end of the continuum, there's something called dissociative identity disorder, where you have fragmented senses of selves that may or may not be familiar with each other. So I'm not saying that they would say that, but they would say that you're dissociating parts of that experience because they're too painful. And that when you can remember, it might be because you're more grounded or whatever. IFS, internal family systems therapy, says everybody has parts. So it's not just people who are diagnosable with a psychological illness, but every human being has parts. And they fall into a couple of categories. There are managers who kind of manage our everyday life. There are firefighters who take over, like if the managers can't handle what we're doing, somebody steps in to handle the emergency. And usually it's kind of a shit show. So if you think about a firefighter, if your house is on fire, they come in, they break the windows, they get the hoses out, and they leave it an absolute wreck. So a firefighter is going to come in and might use some strategy that's maybe not all that great for you. You know, like for me, it might be like binge eating. For others, it might be something else, how they handle stress. But it's not really good for you, but it might soothe you at the moment. And then there are protector parts that kind of hold all the things that are too painful to deal with until you're ready. And IFS therapy would say that all of us have these parts. And so in IFS therapy, what you're describing would be classified as your protector parts are holding these memories until your managers are able to deal with them. And the times that you do remember are times where you probably have more capacity to deal with them without getting flooded or upset. But again, realize I'm not a therapist. My explanation of IFS therapy may very well be oversimplified, and others certainly would have other viewpoints, but that is my non-pathologizing view and mine alone. Okay.
If you want, Lori,
oh yeah, you want to jump in, Amy?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if you can see my video or not because my screen's all weird. I hope. All right. Well, anyways, forget about that. I usually, when something is traumatic, it doesn't get stored in our memory. Like it's like on a really different place in your brain. Yes. And there's the well-studied sort of nostalgia effect that for most of us, things get better over time. The memory of it is much more beautiful than the reality was. And so, but if it was traumatic, you recall it when you recall it as if no time has gone by, like just like it just happened, which to me, watch it, like, I don't want to get too political, but watching Brett Kavanaugh trials and recognizing that she could recall every minute of it, and it was like he didn't remember that, is absolutely in line with what I believe about memory and trauma.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. That's actually the next thing I was going to talk about. If you look at the bottom of the slide,
you rock. We're right on
the
the same
hippocampus
page.
is also trauma specialists also call the hippocampus the brain's timekeeper. And when your hippocampus is underactive, it throws off the timekeeper, so that when other people can think about something as a memory that happened in the past, people who experience trauma experience that as something that's happening right now. Sometimes we call that flashbacks. But we can experience that with alarming accuracy and alarming affect. The emotion is really right there as if it's happening now. So therapy that can activate the hippocampus can help both of those things. It can help memory and fear responses, and can help ground people in the present moment. The insula. The insula helps us recognize sensations and body experiences. So it helps us identify things like feeling hungry or jittery or chilly. And it also can help us understand emotions, because emotions we experience in our body. So for example, if you're feeling anxious, your heart might be racing. Or if you're stressed, you might like have butterflies in our stomach or a stomach ache. So in trauma, especially in people with PTSD, a dysregulated insula interferes with our ability to work with our physical sensations. And this can be extreme in either direction, right? So an underactive insula, we don't really know what we're feeling. And we also are really checked out to our bodies. So that can cause numbing and dissociation. A hyperactive insula causes us to be pretty emotionally reactive and hyper aroused in a way. So trauma therapy that helps us regulate the insula can help people feel safely embodied. A lot of trauma survivors, I was on that end of the continuum, just like maybe TMI, but I just sort of floated in my head most of my life, pretending I didn't have a body. Didn't want, my body was a place that bad shit happened. I didn't want to think about it. It took me a long time to want to live there. Anyway. And now I'm not so sure I want to live there. Sometimes it depends on the day. Today's not one of those days. Anyway, having a bad body day. Oh, will be better. Sorry. Anyway.
You got it, Laura? I got you.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're
doing an amazing job. And that to me makes it so much clearer that body and mental health and physical health are kind of connected. They're absolutely the same thing, yet we just haven't figured out how to. It is very frustrating. Of course, you're going to have physical symptoms. And the ACEs study was one of the researchers was in the obesity clinic. They
Yeah.
were really looking at this piece about what happens to your body, like when you've experienced trauma.
Yeah. I mean, there is a much higher percentage of people who are fat. And I like the word fat. Other people find it pejorative, but I just feel it's a descriptor, better than overweight, because overweight to me is like you're supposed to be at a certain weight, but you're not, you're over it. And so, yeah, a lot of people who have experienced trauma are fat. And, I fought all my life to feel comfortable in this body, not only because of the trauma, but because I fit no societal standard of beauty. And a lot of times I feel okay. But yesterday, something happened yesterday that kind of brought that to the fore again. And, it will settle back down. But it's hard to be a woman in this society to feel good about your body on any given day in general. But let's move on. The prefrontal cortex is really responsible for, it's the thinking center of the brain. It's really what makes us human. It allows for decision-making, concentration, awareness of others. It lets us have empathy and social intelligence. A specific part of that is called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It allows for self-awareness and self-regulation. A healthy prefrontal cortex lets us have healthy relationships. But a traumatized brain, traumatized prefrontal cortex tends to be underactive, and all of those functions become more difficult. So therapy to increase that activation can help all of those areas. And I'm just going to move on because I'm realizing that I'm getting a little over time. Because I wanted to go over the cognitive things, and then I'm done. So the three areas, the social, emotional, the physical, and the cognitive. The cognitive is the last one, and I wanted to leave time for questions. So I'm going to try to get through this one relatively quickly, maybe 5 more minutes, and then I'll stop. Is that all right?
Great. Sounds great.
Okay. So cognitive developmentally, there are difficulties related to child sexual abuse. Early trauma often leads to an inability to access feelings. We call this clinically alexithymia. It's hard to describe what you're feeling or to distinguish bodily sensations. And we already talked about why that is true in the brain. It is difficult to regulate emotions. Oftentimes, child sexual abuse survivors feel that they're on an emotional roller coaster. They have a lot of emotional lability, and that interferes with maintaining quality relationships. And that potentially leads to people who want to get off that damn roller coaster using substances, eating disorders, self-injurious behaviors to try to deal with that. Another problem cognitively is self-referential processing, having trouble like kind of figuring out who you are, yourself, how you view yourself in the world. Often child sexual abuse survivors view themselves, doesn't matter who they are as adults, how other people see them, how much they've accomplished in life, they see themselves as worthless, unlovable, broken, not worthy of being treated well. And that leads them oftentimes to unhealthy relationships. And that's controlled by another area of the prefrontal cortex as well. And here's again, another example of how traumatic memories are processed differently than other forms of memories. And it talks again a little bit about how autobiographical memories are often sensory and fragmented and non-sequential. I actually covered all that. I didn't realize I covered all that. Oh, and that's the last slide. So I did already talk about that. So I got through that more quickly than I thought. So I'm going to stop there. And so we do actually have half an hour for questions. That's it. And I'll stop. Should I stop the share, or do people want me to maybe reference the slides?
I think that you should stop the share
Okay.
so people can see each other. I did see my camera was way tipped up. I'm like, whoa, they got to see my ceiling for a little while. Sorry about that. Production values on Trauma Training Tuesday could be kicked up a notch. We're hoping Bill can help. I don't know if people had any sort of, if anybody just wants to jump in and ask questions. I know from kind of knowing Lori and knowing this material, like this is really triggering stuff for a lot of people. And whatever you need to do to take care of yourself is what you should do. Like put yourself first. And if that means you turn off your camera or whatever you need to do, please do that. Your mental health is so valuable. More like just so valuable, sorry. So I don't know if anybody just kind of wants to jump in and ask a question. I know that people, that was a lot of information as well. There's so much to take in on that topic. But please feel free to just unmute and jump in.
Amy, I just had a comment for Lori. Hi, it's Narissa from
Hi.
Worcester Justice Childhood Trauma. And
Hi, Narissa.
Hi. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing, Lori. It was really informative, but as well, I know that it takes an emotional toll on you as well. You know, you make yourself vulnerable when you share things like this with a group. And I just want to commend you on that, because I know that's also healing as well. And, that could be therapeutic, and it's not easy to share. And I just wanted to say thank you for that. A lot of people may struggle with, the way their body reacts, or, with their feelings, and they may not know why, but you really took the time to, dive deep into explaining how the body reacts to trauma. And I want to say thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Narissa. I can't wait till I can actually see you in person again. I miss you so much. And I just want to say something to put it out there. I did get emotional, but I don't want people to feel like they need to engage in caretaking. I'm usually not emotional. I usually, feel that I can feel this stuff, but, occasionally it creeps up. I just had a really shitty day yesterday, really shitty. And I haven't processed it yet, so.
I think that's one of the things that this does too, right? Like one of the biggest pieces in trauma work is this idea of triggers, that things are going to happen that are completely out of your control, that cause this emotional response in you that's unexpected and overwhelms you in that moment. Like this is what people live with when they've had trauma, especially in childhood.
Yeah. So what, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that. Hi, Lori. Hi, everyone. I think I wanted to jump right in, because on that, I think for me, what comes to mind is purpose in pain. And unknowingly, Lori, I think that's the relatability that you have created today is amazing, because you have made it very relatable. Like it's like a one-on-one, really, and I think when that happens, it literally just brings out the purpose in pain. Like it doesn't necessarily mean you won't feel it, or you won't have moments that you're like, you thought you were a 10 and all of a sudden you're a 0. But the fact that you are, that you're equipped to even share a lot doesn't necessarily, it's an encouragement to let us know that it is okay not to be okay. So yeah, and that purpose in pain. So thank you very much. And I'm sure just from that, the openness and the vulnerability to be here, I'm sure has gone a long way for most of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your empathy.
I love that piece too. It did make me think about the times we're in with like just racism, COVID, these big forces, and not being able to have anything be business as usual. I think a lot of us are forced to start reconciling our own stuff in this space, and it's definitely gonna impact our mental health. Maybe for some people it'll be better. I am worried that it's gonna impact our mental health for the worst. But this is exactly the right stuff to do. Someone posed in the chat, like, I want to tell the story. I want to talk about what happened to me. What do you think? That is exactly the right thing to do. The more you hope to get to be like Dr. Dawson, where you can talk about this really heavy, intensive stuff without the flood of feeling, right? And that just comes with doing it again and again. And of course, if you're able to tell the story to somebody who gives you empathy, like, amazing. That's exactly the right thing. You know, everyone who knows me knows I have a Brene Brown obsession, but
Yes.
Brene Brown really talks about shame. And shame is like, I'm mixing my concepts, but shame to me is like an invisible backpack that comes with the trauma experience that you didn't ask for, you didn't want, but it just comes. It's just there. And so no matter what happened, like, you feel the shame, even though you had no role in it or no part of it. And shame needs three things to survive: silence, secrecy, and judgment. So when you tell your shame story and you're met with kindness and empathy and understanding, that's the magic. That's absolutely the magic. And it's really one of the only things that can help you move forward and get better. And of course, I feel like being in community with people that have a shared trauma is amazingly healing, because we can talk about it forever all the time. And other people get really tired of hearing about it.
Yeah. So I want to share like a clinical piece to this. There is something called an affect bridge. So an affect bridge means that if something feels like something you've experienced before, the situation can be totally different. So if you were a trauma survivor, you've experienced child sexual abuse. And when you experience that, as Amy said, one of the things you absolutely are feeling is shame. And for me, one of the things I felt that lots of sexual abuse survivors feel is feeling powerless. You can do nothing about the situation. So anytime I encounter a situation where I feel shame or I feel powerless, even if the situation has nothing to do with abuse, I'm just feeling powerless in that situation, it is a very powerful trigger. The affect, the emotion bridges me back, makes me feel like in that same situation where I'm a 4-year-old girl and can do nothing about it. So, that's where the affect comes from. It's just like so high, so quickly. I am, though, at my age, like my prefrontal cortex actually freaking works most of the time. I'm able to process that, but it just happened. And then I had to come home and write these slides. So I'm not quite done processing, but the affect bridge is real. Oh, you're muted, Amy.
Go ahead, Chris. We want you to. I'm super glad that Chris is here. Honestly, I specifically want to invite him because I know that you're comfortable talking about this topic, and I want to say that, just put that out there. For men, it's so much harder to talk about this and to get help and to reach out. This is stigma, and it's real, and it takes so much. Even when you know about stigma, you still have that oh, I can't share anything, I'm gonna get judged. And so the courage that it takes to be out there about something is really just important and admirable. So just wanted to give you that introduction.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate it. And Lori, so I guess my question for you is, was your research and the information that you presented, just for clarification, because I did for my own self-care walk away and some moments, that's why I left my camera off. Was it tailored to any subpopulation, or is it kind of a blanket statement for all populations, people of color, males? Like, is there any tailored presentations that you need to do, or is trauma really is this what really happens to basically all genders and all races, or would there be a tailored presentations for different folks?
So, I mean, this presentation was just on child sexual abuse and it was very generic. I would say if you add to that kind of the systemic trauma of living with racism, or the systemic trauma of living with transphobia, homophobia, living in poverty, it just adds to it. My research, actually, I'm very proud that the study wasn't great. I'm just going to admit this, like, it was not the greatest study, but in the late 80s, I am one of the first published authors to have something published on domestic violence in the LGBT community. And it was a start. There have been many, many better studies since then, but I would say that any oppressed group is going to experience trauma in much more extreme ways because it's just exponentially compounded.
Thank you, Lori. And I want to just share my experience and that I could relate to you. I just brought up with my therapist, like, I have this weird thing because I had to go to hotels. And I just, when my sheets have like a certain bleach odor to them, like the smell of a hotel, it really puts me in like a negative place that sometimes, like, I'll feel like that. So what I would do is the sheets would make me feel comfortable. And in the hotels, they were all like that weird bleach scent. And so I can definitely relate to the senses and trauma. So thank you for your presentation. It was helpful in a lot of ways.
Thanks, Chris.
I also always say that if for every marginalized identity you have, so around gender, around orientation, like, that puts your baseline stress level higher. So, and that, when I worked at the Department of Mental Health for a while, and that was one of my biggest takeaways. These were people that were so stressed at baseline that something that was in fact stressful, like getting your phone turned off, stressful, but that would put them in the hospital, right? Like, so I just think one of the challenges is for people that do have less power in our culture, it's stressful. Your daily life is stressful. And, Joanne Gravel mentioned the ACEs study a couple of times. We're thinking ACEs study. Though each of those things is like an ACE point, and we know that your ACE score and your life expectancy are really closely correlated, right? And we're seeing that play out in this pandemic as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if other people had to jump in, if I was missing anybody. It's a lot.
Lori, could you describe you mentioned internal family systems, you mentioned some like somatic healing work. Can you describe kind of other treatment modes that are really effective for any one of those areas, neurological, cognitive, or I know you said you're not a clinician, but what is research evidence-based to work?
Sure. I can give it a shot, and then I'm going to ask Amy to jump in too, because Amy is a clinician. So what some of the things that I'm aware of, I'm honestly like just blanked for a second. In terms of the somatic work, there is a lot of evidence that says like there are both bottom up and top down processing issues in the body, that if you can connect the mind and the body, the brain with the body, you can change, like literally change the brain and the neuronal networks. Like a lot of the things I didn't really talk about is not only can you change some of the structures in the brain, but you can change the way that different areas of the brain communicate with each other. So I'm not sure if so there's an analogy, like if you walk across the grass every day, you're going to leave a path in the grass. But then if you stop walking that grass, that path closes up and you don't see it anymore. And so parts of the brain that don't communicate, that path disappears. You can reactivate those paths. And there are different ways that you can do that through, some cognitive techniques as well as some body techniques. So there's a whole host of trauma-informed body work, like trauma-informed yoga. There's like somatic therapies like that try to help people experience their bodies in safe ways. And there's a lot of evidence base to that.
Sorry, I was having puppy problems.
There's a lot of work. There's a lot of work in attachment theory. Some of the attachment stuff that I talked about with Ainsworth. There's a growing body of evidence that if you're not securely attached, your life is impacted forever. And if you think about that, the slide that I showed with all of those columns of what your adult life looks like, if you don't have a secure attachment, there are a lot of problems. You're not living your best life. But there's something called earned secure attachment. Earned secure attachment means that you're not doomed for the rest of your life, that you can get securely attached. And you can do that in a number of ways. One kind of therapy talks about you parenting yourself, like trying to be nurturing and self-loving and giving yourself the things that you didn't get when you were a kid. So one way to do that is through meditation, kind of like the Buddhist philosophy. There are, so I don't know if anyone dabbles in meditation, but there are 4 sublime states. Metta is loving kindness. There is, so that's compassion, forgiveness, or I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I'm just going to stick with metta because that's the one that is like the one that is relevant here. Is you gradually extend the desire for loving kindness to everybody in the world, but you start with yourself, compassion with yourself. You can also work with a therapist, which is, the self part might work for some people, but oftentimes if you've had a really crappy childhood, you're not going to be able to do it by yourself. So there are a whole group of therapists that work with attachment therapy. And attachment therapists might work with you and, kind of talk to you with, like, let's talk about your little kids. I worked with an attachment therapist once with, those Russian dolls, those Russian stacking dolls. And, we would lay them out and like, so how old is this kid? That's like, how old were you then? What was that feeling like? And we would literally like, kind of like move them around and like lay them out and say, yeah, that was a really young injury. That was a really young kid. who experienced that. You weren't even talking. You know, that was a pre-verbal thing, wasn't it? Where, no, maybe not pre-verbal. Can't remember that far back, but attachment work. And that has shown tremendous promise. There is, there's stuff in cognitive behavioral stuff that there's evidence-based there. It's not my cup of tea personally, but there's a strong evidence base for that. And it's probably one of the more prominent areas of study in master's training now. And I'm going to stop right there and turn it over to Amy.
Hans just wants to make everybody smile before we wrap up because
Yeah.
it's an intense topic. So, you know, he's really here to just be in that dog spirit. Chris messaged me, and thank you so much, Chris, for maybe just the importance of putting out there that if you did get really triggered and you feel like you need some extra support, Pathways for Change really specializes in this and has a 24-hour hotline. And I maybe Chris, if you have it handy, you could put it in there. That would be great. A lot of my work is with the Child Trauma Training Center, and they train clinicians mostly on cognitive behavior therapy for children. And basically, CBT has been shown to be helpful with so many things because it's just taking apart like what's happening, like what are you thinking, what are you feeling, how is that making you act, like, and when you just kind of slow that out, stretch that out, you kind of feel like you have a lot more control points, right? Like if you recognize it at this point, now you could maybe gain some new skills and do things differently. Also, narrative therapy is sort of the telling the story of it. For kids, the cognitive behavior stuff folds in so many pieces, like telling the story. One of the things that struck me so much working in that, like doing that work with them, they talked about responsibility, and they have this sort of pie chart that they use with kids. And in the beginning of the therapy, the kids, like this relates to Shame Backpack, the kids usually feel like they were really responsible for the things that happened to them. Like it was their fault. And we know that is, you know, Lori said it, like young kids cannot protect themselves from perpetrating adults. They just can't. No young kid can, yet they still think they can. They blame themselves. They think they must have done something. And in some ways, the goals of therapy is to get them to realize, like, that was not your fault. You were a kid. And, you know, like any range of experiences like that, but that's a big part of the trauma experience is your self-doubt. Lori talked about it earlier, you can't tell if things are safe or not safe. You're not really good at assessing things. You can't stop thinking about it, or you organize your life to do everything possible to not think about it. So, and Chris sort of asked that question, and I think there are a lot of elements that are just common in trauma, no matter who you are and what your trauma was. You're either all in or all out. You can never find a middle ground. It's hard to regulate yourself, right? Like that's the space this work is in. And honestly, knowing that this is uniform textbook, I think is really helpful for people. So you don't feel like it's something's wrong with me. You feel like, wow, anybody who had something really bad happen to them can expect to have this list of symptoms. We think about trauma as an injury, not an illness. It can become an illness, just as any untreated injury could. And so I think a lot of the physical health ways we think about things, when you try to apply that in mental health, things get clearer and make more sense, but we just don't do that. Blah, blah, blah. Thank you, Chris, for putting that in the chat. I really appreciate that. We're so grateful again that so many people continue to show up for like really hard stuff. I just think that speaks so much to like who we are as people, like who you all are as individuals, that you're willing to come here and listen to this and be triggered. Even if you didn't have this experience, of course you're gonna, like, it's hard stuff, but you care enough to be able to help other people and have more empathy and understanding. And that is so meaningful. It's so, I think it's what's gotten us through to the point as much as we could say we've gotten through this, it's really the most helpful thing, and the only thing that really helps is the caring relationships. Thank you. All right, we'll and again, we'll post the recording on the Worcester Address Childhood Trauma Facebook page. I usually send it out as part of a PDF afterwards. Dr. Dawson and I both work for CYCJ, the Collaborative for Youth and Community Justice at Clark University, and we're hoping that stuff gets up on that website. We're not as tech savvy, you might have caught on, as we'd like to be, but we have some great friends that are, so that should be helpful. Thanks again. Take care. Yeah. Go with love, loving kindness.
Yes. Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Bye.